Who I assigned to read the speaking section at a minimum, raise your hand. Only one person was raising their hand. Okay, 2, 3, all right, that's better. 4, still worried because there are definitely at least 6 of each. 5, okay, you guys are thinking about it. All right. So how about this? If you've read this is going to be more complicated.
People are saying they're in about the same spots. They should be in groups of like.
That's true. If you're roughly in the same spot, which that's a good point. So roughly people are gravitating. Well, you guys were up there, weren't you? We'll try it. We'll try it. If we have a group that just is sort of sitting there twiddling their thumbs, then I guess we'll have to move people around. But hopefully you'll be able to find some basic expertise among the different people in the group. So what we're going to do today, obviously, is pick apart some of the language strategies sections, the section and the individual chapters. Before we start, though, I'd like to take a few minutes to answer any questions that came up during the blog. I saw that the vast majority of you posted about an hour before class started, which is fine, I guess. But if you can try to post a little bit earlier, then we do get much more substantive discussion. But what I did notice is many of you read through a series of your peers' posts, and that's exactly what this activity is designed to do. It's designed to compel or at least push you to read some of your peers' thoughts. It's really hard to have sort of thoughtful discussion in a large lecture hall like this. And so that's one way that we can look at some of these specific issues in more detail and with some more thought. Let me turn this off so you don't get to see all of my inbox, which is filled with all sorts of things as I bring up my PowerPoint. But while I do that, actually, let me first put us on 20201 WordPress. Let me bring up the blog. Anybody come across anything that struck them as particularly interesting, or did anyone encounter any sort of conundrums, questions, bafflement? 72 comments. Wow, this morning I think there were like 30. So. Nothing? Well, again, the reticence. All right, I can see you're all. Nothing struck you. You could have fooled me because many of you went on for paragraphs about different things. We're going to, of course, encounter a lot of this over the course of our talk today. But I wanted to give you a chance to ask any particular questions at the start. I see there are none, so I'll go ahead and keep moving on. All right. Let me bring up PowerPoint. Oh, one other thing that I need to announce. For those of you, a couple of you have written to me about language testing. All languages are going to be, or should have already been tested through the actual OPI system, or at least you should be scheduled to be tested through the actual OPI system. The only exception to that, which I did not note in my email to you, is Irish. So a number of people have contacted me about Irish. I see some nodding heads. And sorry for the confusion, but that is the only language that is not covered under the actual guidelines. And we are working very diligently to try to come up with an alternative before the end of the semester. That will likely take the form of a more voluntary exam, and it will be brief and non-punitive as the regular exam is. But given the delay, if some of you have other things going on, there won't be this withholding of your grant funds, given the fact that we're taking longer to get that together. It's taken longer than I anticipated, actually. Any other questions about the grant? You saw my announcement about funds disbursement. Those check requests are being processed right now. I expect them to start coming in possibly by tomorrow, probably more likely early mid next week. We did the biggest batches over the course of yesterday and today, but all of them are now in the pipeline and should be available very, very shortly. Any questions about logistics? Yeah.
I still haven't seen Word actually sponsored travel form.
Oh, no, I'm glad you brought that up. That was brought to my attention earlier today as well. Where are you going, remind me?
Montpelier.
Okay. Go ahead and send an email. Did you contact my assistant?
Well, since Tina's out of town, I contacted the other
Correct.
one, but
Yeah.
she wrote me back today saying that she just to email the guy.
Okay.
The guy
That's going to be our strategy for this week. In the future, Tina will be able to serve as a liaison, but go ahead and email Ray Pellegrini. He is the compliance officer. He's the one who actually makes the decisions, unless they're very nuanced. And so he should be able to give you a quick thumbs up or thumbs down. Again, there's definitely no problem with Montpellier, France, so don't worry. But it is sort of a technicality, and legally, we need to have that approved before we can issue funds. Right. Yeah. Any other questions about disbursement, testing? Okay, all right, well then I guess we'll jump right to it. Get my pretty graphic there, second pretty graphic. All right, so language strategies is what we're focusing on today. I want to start by elucidating a really fundamental issue in theoretical and applied linguistics. And to do that, I have a handout. It's actually a table from a very famous paper published about 8 years ago. And if you could pass those along to the next table as well. I'm not counting here, I'm just taking out chunks of. It may not be enough. This is a paper written by Noam Chomsky, which should ring a bell for many of you. He is, by all accounts, the most famous linguist and language philosopher of the 20th century. And Mark Hauser, who's so Chomsky's at MIT, barely does any linguistics anymore, mostly just writes a lot of very left-leaning political stuff. Mark Hauser is a psychologist, a cognitive psychologist at Harvard, and he does some very, very interesting things related to morality and universal morality, if you're curious about some of the other work that relates to what we're looking at. And then the third guy doesn't really matter. He's a psycholinguist, and he's of no consequence to our discussion. But what I want to say is that language is made up of roughly 2 types of cognitive faculties. There are faculties that are specific to the language enterprise, that is, understanding and producing language. And then there are sort of general cognitive faculties that aren't specific to language. They weren't, depending on your disciplinary focus, they either didn't evolve in that direction or they weren't present for that purpose. And I give a couple of examples here. So examples of sort of prototypical language-specific faculties in the mind are things like the lexicon. This is your mental dictionary. It's where you keep the words in your head. That is a mental cognitive faculty specific to language, right? It interfaces with other faculties like your conceptual system, where you go, but the actual lexicon itself is specific to language. Just as syntax, or the sort of the deep structure, the deep grammar, is specific to language, right? Other examples of general cognitive faculties, however, are just about everything else our mind does. From analysis of all sorts, pattern recognition as a specific example of that, judgments, evaluations, I mean the list goes on and on and on. But it's important to think of these as distinct processes. So in this sense, I want to say that language is as much ground in specific skill sets, so cognitive faculties that are tied to language-specific purposes, and this usually is what takes the designation of a skill or a language modality, the 4 modalities: speaking, reading, listening, writing. I think I got them all. Those are sort of typically how we think of language, and then maybe sort of grammar is thrown in as the phantom 5th modality. But that's not all that language is. Language is also necessarily predicated upon these general cognitive strategies, which implicates this larger sort of intellectual endeavor in language learning and then the use of language. So in this sense,